connected as one technology, but as I researched more and more, I saw how connected they are. In fact, they're like Mutt and Jeff. They can't do without each other, and that this was a huge global endeavor run primarily by the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy, so I wrote that book. That came out in June 2014. And I've been working ever since to get the word out to people, to try to undo the damage done to many people who no longer read and no longer have the confidence in themselves to be able to read a book for laymen, but hefty on the end of research in order to forever destroy the ridiculous premise that it's all conspiracy theory. So I also became friends with Billy Hayes, the HARP man. He worked on as a team leader on building the Gakona, Alaska facility and 200 and some other facilities around the world when he worked for a nameless agency through defense contractors. And he convinced me that the next phase of this is the return to the SDI program, the Strategic Defense Initiative of the 80s, that it had been put to bed, i.e. gone black, while they got Bernard Eastland his patent for HARP up and running and did some experiments with the ionosphere. And now we were entering the phase where the space fence was operant, and the space fence being a very serious next step of this technology. So that's really my whole learning curve for the last few years has been, the preparation for writing about the space fence, and I will be done with that book in 2 months, and the Farrell House will bring it out in the spring of 2017.
Okay, neat. Yeah, a lot more that we want to get into in that stuff and talk a little more about the creatures. I did hear something about them and the dried blood and things like that in the chemtrail residue, which goes obviously way beyond weather modification and climate destruction, which is obviously intentional, but there's going to be some interesting stuff to go into there. Russ Tanner, why don't you tell us the same thing go back to before you were directly involved with the geoengineering or chemtrails, and what got you interested and how it evolved into what you're doing now?
Sure. It started for me back in the early 90s. I was volunteering for a political party, doing research, doing some legal research, and started to learn about the corrupt nature of government. I had done my own research 10 years before that and dabbled a little bit. But as time went on, I realized that mainstream media worked in concert with the government to spread disinformation and to promote the agenda of the super rich. And so that was a great introduction. That was a great 20-year introduction and body of research that got me into law libraries and into universities doing this type of research. Then in my health journey began when between 1995 and 2000, I started getting very sick. And it took me 5 years to discover the source was mercury from my amalgam fillings. I had those out in July of 2000 and had a miraculous 24-hour recovery where 85% of my symptoms were gone in 24 hours, and 3 months later, all the rest of my symptoms were gone. And I began to do intense research and found out about the mercury cover-up, which I'd already known a lot about, but I didn't realize that amalgam fillings had mercury in them. And so I began to find that the FDA and the other government agencies and industry had been complicit in making sure that people get as much mercury in their body as possible. I wanted to know why, began researching that, began researching detox, ailments, caused and how to support and fix those ailments naturally. And had 5 years, actually 4.5 years of absolute bliss. I never knew you could feel so good. I never knew you could feel so strong. Changed my life. Then in 2005, I had moved to Jamestown, New York, where they started spraying one day, very, very low altitude spraying. Large jets, which you never see in Jamestown because they can't, their airport cannot handle large jets. But they came and started gridding the sky, and it took me all of about 30 minutes to have a rude awakening because I smell and taste what they're spraying, to the point where I had intense muscle and joint pain, headache. I couldn't focus. I had an employee meeting that evening with my 3 employees that I canceled because I felt so sick. My sinuses were burning. I could taste the metallic taste in the air. And that was my rude awakening. I immediately went online, found Clifford Carnicom's website and a few others, started reading about this, and realized that this was absolutely real, because you can't smell and taste something that's not there and have the symptoms. And every day from that point forward, they sprayed on a schedule. I started tracking the schedule, tracking the different types of spray, tracking the symptoms, tracking the effects on other people, started writing a series of articles. I put up the globalskywatch.com website to document the things that I had learned and the information I put together about it. And that work has continued to this day. It's been 11 years of suffering that I've gone through and attempting to wake up members of the public. My main business developed in the 90s, in the mid-90s, after all the political research that I was involved in and the legal research, into forming a publishing company that published scientific information that was fully referenced about herbs and nutritional supplements to help wake the world up to information that was being held back from the public that they deserve to know about. And that work continues to this day as well.
Okay, neat. So what I want to do, since apparently it's still true that the vast majority of humans on this planet don't know any of this stuff is going on, amazing as that seems to the people that are aware of it. And so since it's mainly for them that we're doing this, to let them know that there's a lot more happening than they're currently in touch with. So I want to go back to the kind of question that most of them would have, is that you're talking about some kind of spraying. I don't think you're talking about spraying for insects. And I don't think you're just talking about cloud seeding, which we've heard of somewhere. So what, in simple terms, is happening, and why is it happening? And I just want to share ideas here. So anybody that wants to just offer simple explanations to people that were brave enough to start listening to this show or an archive, but really haven't quite grasped what we're getting at. So we want to bring it down to be really easily understandable to anybody who's willing to be open to it. So what's going on? And just to somebody that I thought those were clouds of just strange shapes in the sky, you're telling me that they're not clouds, or they're a weird kind of cloud, or what? I mean, I'm sorry if this sounds too basic, but this is where most people, I think, still are. So let's talk directly to them. What are we saying is happening over our heads? Anybody that wants to offer any comments?
Well, Russ, you said on the phone that you've spent a lot of time on jet fuel. Well, why don't we start there?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been a skywatcher all my life. As a child, in sixth grade, I could tell you all the fighter jets and the rockets the U.S. had in service. I collected pictures of jets, thousands of pictures over time. This was something I loved doing. I eventually took flight lessons, had military and pilots in the family. And so I was a skywatcher all my life from young childhood. And in my experience, I've lived in Maryland, not far from Dulles Airport, and I grew up mostly in north of Tampa Bay, so you couldn't look in the sky without seeing a jet. Every 4 to 6 weeks, we'd see a couple, I don't know, F-16s or 18s or something fly overhead. And in all of the thousands and thousands and thousands of jets living in the busiest airspaces in the world, I have never seen a trail come out of a jet engine. So when I first experienced this, I was immediately, I knew something was wrong when I smelled and tasted the fallout, which they were flying so low, it only took about 30 minutes for this stuff to reach ground level. So I knew that whatever it was heavy and was descending very quickly, but there was some component of it or condensation forming from particulates that was left at that altitude that spread out and covered the sky. So there were two components. There was something condensing in the atmosphere, and there was something falling down rather quickly. In my research, I have collected from around the world dust samples, blood samples, rainwater samples, soil samples, and I've published them on the Global Skywatch website. And the pattern that we're finding is elevated aluminum, elevated barium, sometimes elevated strontium, and in the last 10 years spread out throughout that time, we've started to see an increase in mercury, cadmium, lead, and arsenic from the incoming samples. My own sample of rainwater in the Bangor, Maine area showed 300 micrograms per liter of aluminum in the rainwater, which is, of course, 5 times higher than is allowed by the EPA in the secondary recommendation, maximum recommendation levels that they publish. So I know that when people go to an airport, having a very sensitive sense of smell that I do and sense of taste, even when I'm approaching an airport, and I've talked to many hundreds of people who also have this same experience, you can smell kerosene burning, because that's primarily what jet fuel is. And you can smell that scent surrounding the airport. When you're walking down the halls, it's just everywhere. When you see a jet take off, you'll see exactly what you expect from burning kerosene, as you see a black soot component that comes out the back. It was very much a shock to me in one respect when I started in 2005 seeing the trails in the sky, having had so much experience as a sky watcher, having a lot of knowledge of aviation and some personal experience in that area. I knew that something was wrong. I knew immediately something was wrong. And of course, as I started talking to more and more people from more and more countries, we started seeing this pattern where the spraying would start suddenly in any given area, and it kept spreading from one area to another, to another, to another. So it was a growing program that just expanded dramatically between 1995 and kept growing through 2005.
Okay, Russ, you mentioned the air and water, I guess water samples is what you were talking about, that were coming back with all these toxic components. And let's just let people know how we know that that's not just rain falling through city air pollution.
Well, first of all, my sample was taken way out in the middle of nowhere. I live in rural Maine. Okay, good. Plus, so there should be no aluminum, especially not, 5 times above the normal level. The other thing is that we're getting correlating evidence everywhere, and especially areas where they have been witnessing tremendous amounts of chemical aerosols in the sky. And again, I'll remind everybody, there should be nothing visible coming out of a jet engine except for the faint black soot you see at the airport. The jets don't magically start producing these enormous plumes, 300-foot wide plumes that spread out and cover the sky. This has never happened before. This historically has not happened. So many of the tests that we've collected, we see the same patterns. And in California, where we've seen so much heavy spraying overhead, they had aluminum tests that are orders of magnitude above what I even had here. So we're talking hundreds of times above maximum safe levels. Even just the water is completely toxic. And then, of course, we see the follow-up of exactly what we would expect. We see insect decline. We see the pH of soils changing. This all happens at the same time. Is this some wild coincidence? No, of course it's not. The animal die-offs, the pH change of the soil, all of the samples, water samples, blood samples, all of this stuff is happening at virtually the same time historically, so it's not a coincidence.
Okay. And Ilana, you were talking about other components besides the ones that Russ just listed, right, with your work with Clifford?
Well, what I wanted, I really appreciate that, Russ. That was really good. What I have done is I've studied the ideas of several people who concentrate on the delivery system itself, and I think it's important to understand that the turbofan engine, what it can do, what it can't do, at what altitude, at what kind of humidity we're talking. I mean, most of these flights now that are really distributing under Project Cloverleaf. And Cloverleaf was initially a military project of dissemination of chemicals, aerosols, and it has enlisted the commercial airliners to also be engaged in this. And so people like Jim Lee at climateviewer.com maintain that the most of what we're breathing now are all additives to the JP8 fuel that they now are using. There's the diesel factor. They're adding things for their own for cost effectiveness. They're adding things for lubrication, but it appears that also there is the other components, including the aluminum oxide, that has to do with either we're being fed these supplementary additives, or it's a separate system on board various airliners, and geographic areas are receiving different components for different experiments, such as when Anne mentioned the lithium over Oregon. All of this has to be considered. The one thing that can't be considered anymore, at least I can't go there, is, are those contrails? Those are not condensation trails. Anyone who thinks that a condensation trail is going to end up looking like that, obviously is in La La Land in my book. So that's what I try to point out, that the aluminum oxide, yes, it's coming out of the backs of jets. It also is coming out of, and we have to add this component. It's coming out of sounding rockets that are being launched. Yeah. I mean, they are putting up so many sounding rockets, and it's just spewing aluminum oxide.
Why don't you explain also what a sounding rocket is for people?
Well, these are rockets that are engaged in various tests. You know, there's the Atlas, there's all different types of rockets. Some of them are taking satellites up. Some of them are just going up to the top of the upper atmosphere and then coming back down and really laying a tremendous trail. And Billy Hayes has been very valuable to me in this, explaining how they are laying the same metals in the upper atmosphere and space, the lower regions of space, that they are laying down here. And this gets into the space fence. So I don't know if you want to talk about that yet, because what's happening is there is a stream of metals, a ring of metals above the Earth, around the Earth at the equator now, that is constantly being built, as if we had a ring of Saturn around us, and it all has to do with C4, command, control, communications, and cyber warfare. And that's the premise of this next book, is to explain why this would happen. I mean, the first thing they had to do was ionize the atmosphere in order to have the SDI program finally operant. And that's really what we're looking at today, is we're all breathing an ionized atmosphere. And so instead of arguing over contrail versus chemtrail, let's just get down to it and realize that when anyone flies in a plane, that jet fuel is chemical, my friends. It is not condensation of water molecules.
I want to ask you one question without losing your train of thought there, because I want to hear about that and the space fence, what it is, why it's up there, and what its purpose is, and how we know that. But before that, just not to lose this thought, you mentioned that commercial airliners were having this stuff added to their fuel, partly legitimate reasons and partly not. But that either that's being controlled from the ground or some other place, or there are some other planes where it's not in the fuel, because some of the spraying is turned on and off clearly in the sky. And if it was a continuous spray out with the exhaust, that wouldn't be what we observe, right? So how do you put that together?
Well, I want to make it clear. I'm not saying, oh, well, that's just the jet fuel. I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I'm saying that the jet fuel, that's just, that's the base. That's the base of a chemicalized atmosphere and what we're all breathing. Just that. And to go into what's in that fuel, the FAA lays it out. I mean, the EPA lays it out. You can study exactly the chemical components in jet fuel. I mean, if you assume they're being honest, I don't know that they're being honest in quantities anyway. So, and they're saying that it's absolutely not harmful for humans. Am I saying there's a supplementary system? Well, yes, I am in some of the aircraft, yes. And that might be the military aircraft. That might be jets that are painted to look like Delta airliners. I mean, the nefarious, underhanded way that this Operation Cloverleaf is being conducted is absolutely staggering. So I think what I want to say to listeners is, let's at least admit that chemicals are being laid and we are breathing them. And now we can discuss how that's being done. Who's producing the chemicals? Are they using supplementary systems on some of the military jets and other jets? All of that can be discussed. Absolutely, because we're down here and they're up there, and it's very difficult to try to get any samplings that they're taking, because sometimes you'll see a plane following behind another aircraft, and that plane is collecting samples of what's coming out of the fuel. And I think, gee whiz, what can I say? This is intentional, absolutely. It isn't just economic. It isn't just a boardroom decision about, to get the most bang for your buck out of the fuel. There are things being added one way or another that are killing us. Just like Dennis Kucinich, by the way, who is the one who tried to get the Space Act passed, and of course it was never passed. Mm-hmm. Space Preservation Act. Yeah,
there's also has to be a really interesting psychology involved, because you've got all these, there's got to be a lot of these planes right now. There's heavy spraying almost everywhere, and you've got so many pilots and crews up there. None of them are heard from, and there's some kind of a psychological system being applied to them to keep all of them from talking and to keep them being willing to murder everybody, including their own families. And I think it's kind of interesting. It makes me wonder the details of exactly how they're keeping them all in line.
Before we get too far afield, I think we should also mention that it's not just trails in the sky anymore. We have all sorts of different spray going on. The one that I found was the lithium spray, and I mean, it was very obvious. You can see in the article that I had just published last month on Positive Health Journal out of London, I posted a bunch of photos that would correlate with what was going on the ground, both psychological, the ultra-violence that was beginning to happen on really bad spray days, and the different symptoms that were being reported to me. And you look up in the sky, and you don't really see that many of the big trails that both Alana and Russ are talking about. You see these big, wide plumes that look like, sometimes they look like angel wings. I mean, they're misty. They can be quite beautiful, actually, especially in the sunset. They glow a beautiful sort of orangey red, pinky gray red, and then they turn into a haze, and you get this whiteout haze over the top of a certain area. And believe me, they can pinpoint the area like you wouldn't believe, literally almost in a square. And lately what they have been doing, and they had experimented over Oregon with this, and I think a few other places in the world like Phoenix, they would make this haze square, and then, in fact, the first place they really tried it, believe it or not, was in Northern California over the fires. Terrible drought. It's terribly dry, and we know the lithium was hitting them. And by the way, when you hit lithium with water, it explodes. And here, right over these terrible fires, and the firemen were just going crazy because they couldn't get the fires out. They were saying it was the most unusual fires they've ever had. And when I looked in the radar images, the satellite images, in this square haze were these tiny, tiny thin lines of spray. And I believe it was Alana who said it was probably aluminum. It was literally, they're turning into a battery in the sky, and they could keep it right in place. And that's what they've now done. So it isn't just the big wide trails that they're spraying. And I want to make that very clear.
So what kind of trail is it that has the lithium in it, and where's it coming from?
There's a good question.
Well, my guess, I want to throw, as long as Ann brought that in, let's bring in the term that I don't like, but I don't have another one, is the chem bombs. And I was talking to Billy Hayes about it on Skype the other day. Again, we go over and over and over the delivery system so that we can get clearer and clearer about how this is being done. The chem bombs were first discussed, 5-6 years ago. I heard them at the, actually in 2012, I heard them at the chemtrails conference down in Los Angeles. I think what that is say the plane is flying along, and we often think that the pilot is sitting in the front and deciding which way to go. But even if there's a pilot, or if it's being done by drone or remote, that pilot is actually following a computerized system himself. He's just sitting there sort of responding to buttons and bells and whistles. And the guidance system of the jet itself, and that would include the delivery system that can be activated or deactivated, as you were saying, Richard, about how suddenly you see that the trail is shut off and then it goes back on. That guidance system is being instructed by the manufacturer to release a different chemical signature, and they can actually release a signature that is completely invisible until it is activated either with radio frequency or laser activity, and then that will suddenly burst And then you can see, and I've seen some YouTubes of people who sent them in, you see a diaphanous sort of angel wing effect coming straight out of this little puff that suddenly becomes this very ethereal looking form. So there are other systems, and they are heading toward invisible trails, absolutely invisible. All you'll see is a milky white sky.
Yeah, it just seems logical that is what they want as soon as possible, so they get rid of these irritating comments from the public.
I've seen the implementation of that in 3 places. I've seen it in Jamestown, New York, in the area I lived in when I first saw trails. They had a 4-day break from the absolute whiting out, gridding of the sky, and on the 5th day they came back, and all of the jets were high altitude, spraying short trails. Then I saw the same thing outside Bangor, Maine in 2011. They did the same thing. They were absolutely whiting out the sky. The Bangor Globe did an article, said it was the dimmest summer in recorded history. They didn't mention the jets were the cause, though.